Hello, my name is Chandran Kukathas. I'm a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics in the Department of Government, and I'm very pleased today to be the second lecturer in the Darwin College lectures. My lecture today will be about immigration. The title is Immigration and Freedom. And the basic argument I would want to put to you today is that immigration control really is fundamentally about the values that people are concerned about when they worry about immigration. But I want to turn this around a little bit to say that actually it's the immigration control that we should be more concerned about. Immigration control is a concern for those who worry about freedom, but it's not the freedom of immigrants that we should be concerned about, it's the freedom of citizens and residents. Immigration control has certain perverse consequences, which I would like to explore in this lecture.
So good evening, and welcome to the second of the 2018 Darwin College lectures on the theme of migration. Last week, David Olusoga opened the series with a very thoughtful lecture on Black and British migration. So if you missed that, or you'd like to see it again, it's freely available to view online via the Darwin College website. Tonight, we turn to the great debates of immigration and freedom. Western society has great pillars underpinning it. If you think of the Greeks, Athens open to the world. And to quote Pericles, we throw open our city to the world and never, by alien acts, exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, although the eyes of an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality. Perhaps that was a boast. Immigrants to Athens did not become citizens. Then there's the law of Moses. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. And perhaps that law was as often broken as observed, but it saved one starving foreigner, Ruth, desperately immigrating with her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth said, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." Ruth was made welcome. Her great-grandson was King David. So advancing rapidly to the 20th century, I turn to an honorary fellow of Darwin College and a Darwin lecturer, Karl Popper. In The Open Society and Its Enemies, he said, "Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them." So where do we go? Do we have open doors, or do we place limits, and by so doing, place limits on ourselves? So please welcome tonight's speaker, Chandran Kukathas. He's Professor of Political Theory at the London School of Economics, and as you can see, he's going to speak on exactly these topics, immigration and freedom. Welcome.
Well, firstly, thank you very much to everyone here for coming, and to Darwin College for inviting me to speak here. It's a great honor, and I'm very, very pleased to be in this series. So let me begin by confessing that I am an immigrant. I am an Australian citizen. I moved to Australia, relinquishing my Malaysian citizenship, and I now live in London. And I'm here to do a job that you obviously needed an immigrant to do because you couldn't find a native, which is always the way. And I'm going to talk to you about immigration and freedom, I think, in a way that hasn't normally been talked about. It's very common for people to say that immigration is something that we need to be mindful of because what's at stake is our values. And this is something that's said, I think, especially in the countries of Western Europe, in the United States, in Australia. And the concern is that somehow, unless we control and manage immigration, our values will be under threat. And I think in the countries of the developed West, modern liberal democracies, those values are predominantly the values of freedom and equality. And what I want to put to you today is that we should indeed be concerned about these values, but the threat to these values comes not so much from immigration as from immigration control. And it's the control on which I want to focus. It's the control, I think, that is the danger or the threat to freedom. And the question is, how is this so? And what I want to do is explore this question a little bit more closely, and also then consider the questions of whether the threat posed to our own society by the effort of control nonetheless warrants the continuing of this control, because there are gains to be made nonetheless. So this is really the theme of my lecture. I want to show you, persuade you, that immigration control is what we should be worrying about, much more than we should be worrying about immigration itself. It's not an argument for open borders. It's not an argument for saying that anything goes, but it is a kind of cautionary argument, saying that those who think too much about the dangers of immigration are neglecting a more important worry, which is a worry about the implications of control. And of course, we live in a world in which there is always immigration, there is always movement. But immigration, because immigration is not just the migration of people, it's really about the crossing by people of political boundaries to move from one jurisdiction, one national jurisdiction, into another. And this has always been something that's been subject to control ever since the modern state came into being, and national boundaries could be policed. On the one hand, people and governments especially have wanted to limit the movement of people, but on the other hand, they've also wanted people to come in. Why? Well, they've wanted them because people are also an asset. For most of human history before the 20th century, the controls states or communities imposed were much more controls on emigration than on immigration. People leaving a society represented a loss to that society. They were not worried about people coming in. They wanted that resource. We live in a different world now. We're worried about people coming in. But on the other hand, we also want them because we need them. The Swiss writer Max Frisch put this very, very plainly when he said, we asked for workers and we got people instead. That, in a way, sums up the dilemma. Modern societies, Western societies, and Eastern, Southern ones no less, want workers. They want the assets that people bring, but they don't necessarily want what comes with this. What comes with this is a lot of baggage, and I want to bring us back to reflecting on this more and more, because attempting to control immigration is really about trying to control people, thinking that you can get the benefits they bring while not taking on board all the baggage that accompanies them, and then you could do so by controlling them. And what I want to say is that actually what you'll do by doing this is end up controlling not those people, but controlling yourselves. This is the basic theme then of my talk. Immigration control ultimately is a danger to freedom, because the price we'll pay for controlling immigration is not controlling outsiders, but controlling insiders. We will not be controlling those beyond our borders. We'll be controlling those within, controlling our own citizens, our own residents, our own people. So in the first half of the lecture, I'm going to really do three things. Firstly, I'm going to look at a very, very important but neglected question, which is the question of the definition of immigration. What exactly is an immigrant? From there, I will turn to a closer consideration of the question of freedom. How is it that immigration control does impact on the freedom of residents and citizens as well as outsiders? Then I'll turn to the question of how this affects the rule of law and equality within a society. And my argument will be that all of these implications and effects are things that we should be worried about. In the second half, or more like the last third of the lecture, I'll turn to the question of whether this is something that we should really be so worried about given the gains that come from immigration. Maybe there are economic gains, maybe there are cultural gains from controlling immigration. Maybe it's simply that this will give us an opportunity to determine our own futures, take back control. And I want to say that all of these arguments ultimately will turn out to be illusory. None of these gains are actually real gains, if they're gains at all. So let me turn then to the first issue, which is the question of definition. So here's an obvious thought. What is an immigrant? And I think it's pretty clear once you reflect on this that an immigrant is not a natural kind. I mean, I can see all these people out here. I couldn't tell just by observing who is an immigrant. But it's not as if we could conduct some closer biological investigation or any kind of naturalistic investigation to figure out who is an immigrant. Someone is an immigrant by definition. Some rule or law has made someone into an immigrant, because it's not even as if we could say, well, an immigrant is someone who's crossed a border, because people cross borders all the time. You cross borders to return home. If a Briton lives in Australia for 10 years and then returns to Britain as a British citizen with a British passport, he is classified as an immigrant to Britain, although he is a citizen. So the question of definition is actually a very, very important one. What is an immigrant? According to the UN, an immigrant is someone who's lived outside his or her country of nationality for 1 year or longer. If you've lived there for 364 days, you're not an immigrant. 365 days or 366, and you are an immigrant. Why should this be the case? Here's a solution for Mrs. May in her endeavor to reduce immigration. Let's say that you're not an immigrant unless you've been away for 2 years, okay? Or make it 5, and now the immigration problem is almost disappearing, okay? Or we could say, look, you're an immigrant if you're in the country for 6 months. Now things are looking pretty bad. Let's say you're an immigrant if you've been here for 2 weeks. Now we have a crisis because about 70 million people cross the border into Britain every year. So we could solve the immigration problem immediately by simply changing the definition. There's nothing special about 1 year. And we know this even just by reflecting on the fact that there have been debates in Parliament about whether students should be counted in the immigration figures. Many of them stay for a little bit longer than a year. That makes them immigrants. When they come in, they intend to stay for more than a year. That makes them immigrants. But they also intend to leave. We know from the statistics that have come out this year, they do leave. About 99% of them leave to return. But if we count them as immigrants, then the immigration numbers go up. If they just count as students, the immigration numbers go down. Why should we pick one definition or another? Well, we know in politics, one reason for changing the definition to include students is this makes it easier to say that there's a crisis. And now we can use this as a means for arguing for more immigration control to reduce numbers elsewhere. Or you can look at it differently and say, look, no, we don't want to count the students, because then we can say there aren't so many immigrants coming, and the government's policies are working after all. Okay? Which side of this definition you stand on is going to depend not on any naturalistic decision-making about who is or isn't an immigrant. There is no such thing. It's going to depend on the politics. And this is the big point that I want to get to. The politics of immigration and immigration control actually begins not with border control, although I'll come to that. It begins with the question of definition. But there's another side of this. If we can ask the question, who or what is an immigrant, and I think we need to ask this question, we can also ask the question, who or what is a native or a national? And this is something that is no less controversial or political. There is no natural kind. If you look at current law across different countries, you'll see many different definitions of a national or a native. If you look just at UK law, you'll see that there are hundreds of different definitions of national that reflect the changes in nationality law going back, especially into the period just after the disintegration, I guess we have to say, of the British Empire. Before 1948, anyone who was a member of the British Empire by being a colonized country was, in fact, a British subject and therefore had a right of residence in Britain. You could say that everyone in the empire was a national. Now, after this, through a series of legislative changes, many of these people lost their nationality. So this is a very interesting question then we've got. What is a national? And the moves that have been made in order to transform the definition, again, have had very little to do with trying to figure out what is a natural kind, what is a national. It has to do with the politics of nationality. Who do we want to include and who do we want to exclude? And we don't include or exclude just by putting up barriers at the border. We choose to do this by deciding what to say about people's identity. Immigration control is about identity politics, but not in the way that people think. It's about identity politics in the sense that it's deciding who is or is not going to fall into a particular definition. And one curiosity you'll note, if you look closely through the history of the law of nationality over the last century in Britain, is that the Irish don't really get mentioned, because this is very complicated. And the best thing to do with the Irish is not to talk about it too much, because if you do, you'll get yourself in an even more difficult definitional tangle. Okay? So you can quietly insert a rule that says, okay, the Ghanaians will no longer have a right of residency. They're no longer British subjects. They no longer hold the sort of passport that will allow you to stay. But with respect to the Irish, you don't want to do any of this. But that tells you quite a lot about the politics of definition. It's really about responding to political circumstances. So when someone says, well, we need immigration control because we need to protect the interests of natives or nationals, and therefore be mindful of what we grant to immigrants or would-be immigrants, the question is, what is an immigrant and what is a national? Now, if it's possible, for example, for a national to be a former immigrant, that changes things quite significantly. This means that, once again, a national is not something or someone who is in a way categorically different from an immigrant. It really means that a national could be someone who was a former immigrant. So your definition of an immigrant could be, well, this is a national in waiting. But in fact, historically, all kinds of rules have obtained. For a long time in the United States, for example, they made it very clear that there were whole parts of the world who could come to America but could never become citizens. They could never become nationals. The Chinese, for a while, were excluded very explicitly on the grounds that they could come and work, but they could never become nationals. But if it's possible for a national to be a former immigrant, then we've got to think very, very differently about how we think about the justification for immigration control. It can't be that the justification is to protect the interests of nationals. But again, looking through the history of countries like Britain, Germany, Australia, the United States, Canada, everywhere the beginning of immigration control is the question of definition. For a long time, for example, someone who married a foreigner in the United States was immediately subject to a loss of nationality. Not necessarily deported, but if a woman married a man who was not a US citizen, she ceased to be a US citizen, even if she had been born in the United States. This changed in the early 20th century, but it didn't change for Native Americans until the mid-20th century, when they were finally recognized as, oddly enough, natives. So there's nothing natural about immigration and the definitional question of immigration. It is all about politics, and therefore it's all about who has the power to command the institutions that define these things. Now, none of this says anything about what policies one should actually pursue, but I think it should give you pause if you're trying to think about the question, okay, what is it that we're doing when we're controlling immigration? What is the justification? But then there's also the question of borders, because although immigration control is fundamentally about defining immigrants and natives in order to decide who has rights and who doesn't, it nonetheless does involve establishing borders. It does involve closing them and opening them. How should we think about this? Many people argue that what we should do is we should just open the borders, and many people argue that they should be closed. But what does this mean? And I want to suggest to you that border control is complicated because, once again, the important thing is actually not the crossing. Millions of people cross all the time, and governments everywhere, including the UK and the US governments, boast about the number of people who come into the country. Immigration control really is not about controlling crossing. It's about controlling what you can do once you've crossed the border. What can you do once you've entered a society? Can you work? Can you go to college? Can you set up a business? Can you get married? Can you buy property? Can you rent? These are the things that are important, and these are the things that are controlled. So here's one way of thinking about immigration control. A society may control it by controlling the crossing, making it difficult or easy to enter a society. They can control it by, say, limiting or extending your rights of participation. That is to say, extending or limiting your rights to work or to reside. Or they can limit it by limiting your capacity to become a full or permanent member of a society, like, for example, by becoming a citizen. Okay? Here's one way of thinking about it. If you think about, let's say, a world of 8 countries, okay? I've imaginatively labeled them 1 to 8. Okay? So in the first country, you could see it looks like the borders are pretty open, because can you enter? Yes. Can you participate? That is to say, work and live? Yes. Can you become a citizen or a member? Yes. And if you imagine country 4, looks like a straightforward case. You can't enter, you can't work, you can't become a citizen. But there are all kinds of variations in between. Imagine country 2. Yes, you can enter. Yes, you can work. But no, you can't become a citizen. A country like Japan is very close to that. It's very difficult to become a Japanese citizen, but relatively easy to enter. And it is possible to get a visa to work. Many countries are like country 3. Okay? Easy to enter if you come from the right country yourself. Not very easy to participate. There may be very, very significant restrictions on your capacity to work and no capacity to become a member. Or if you consider country 5, okay, no, you can't enter, no, you can't participate, but yes, you can become a member. How could that be possible? Well, bear in mind that lots of people do come in despite the rules. So when we say the rules say no, they could still become members because there might be an amnesty after many, many years. And then suddenly, people who were never supposed to be there in the first place do in fact become citizens. Or if you imagine country 8, no, you can't enter, but yes, you've snuck in and you've been able to work, but no, you'll never become a citizen. There are all kinds of variations. Or think of it slightly differently. Imagine 3 countries where in one case it's very easy to enter, very difficult to work, very, very difficult to ever become a member. Or consider the third country where it's very difficult to enter, but once you've got in, it's actually relatively easy to get the right to participate and to work, but very difficult still to become a citizen. Or imagine country B where it's very hard to get in and even harder to get a job, be given the right to do so, but once you're there and you're actually admitted as someone who can participate in this society, very easy to become a citizen. Australia's a bit like that. You know, they don't really like people coming in. They make it hard for them to get the right to get a job. But once you do and you've got permanent residence, they try their best to make you a citizen. In fact, most people who migrate to Australia do become citizens, except for one category of people, and that's Britons. I think, the last Ashes test is not going to change this very much, okay? So my point in this illustration is really to say, when you think about immigration and immigration control, don't think of it as a straightforward matter of border control, which is what all the rhetoric suggests. I want to say it's more complicated because in the first instance, even deciding what an immigrant is and who is a native is a political matter. And this is subject to an intense level of politicking. And the same thing goes for the control of all-be immigrants at the border, to the extent that what's controlled is not just the crossing, what's controlled is all the rights that you might or might not have on entering. And this really brings me to my main theme. Immigration control requires control because it's not just about border crossing, it's about what you can do once you've crossed the border. Especially, it's about whether you can work, whether you can reside, whether you can rent, whether you can buy, whether you can set up a business, whether you can trade, and so on. Now, the point is here that you can't control any of these things without controlling your own citizens and your own residents. Why is that? Well, a little bit of reflection says it's rather obvious. Okay? If you want to control outsiders by preventing them from relating to insiders in ways you don't like, you have to control the insiders as well. If you don't want outsiders to work, you have to control your employers. You have to regulate them, you have to monitor them, you have to survey them, and you have to punish them if they break the law. Similarly, if you don't want people coming in and residing for too long, you've got to monitor them, and it's not easy to track them. So what do? Well, in Britain now, there are regulations that impose certain obligations on landlords. Okay? If you're going to rent to someone, you better check that they are not an immigrant, or if they're an immigrant, that they've got a visa. You've also got to check to make sure that that visa is valid for the duration of the time that that person is renting. This imposes a certain level of responsibility and risk on the landlords, and the threat of fines or punishment if you don't comply with the law. Anyone at a university knows that increasingly universities have to be immigration compliant. When I came to the LSE 10 years ago, there wasn't any part of the LSE that was concerned with this. Now there is an immigration compliance officer who writes to us periodically and says, have you checked up on this particular student or colleague or researcher to make sure that they are still immigration compliant, because there are rules and penalties about this. Now, this imposes a restriction not just on immigrants or would-be immigrants, it imposes something on citizens and residents to the extent that they do anything that's going to relate to outsiders. And the costs can be quite substantial. But there are also other ways in which immigration control has an impact on citizens. not just through these institutions, and these are very important, I think, but simply through the normal operation of everyday life, because strangely enough, people not only want to hire outsiders or to rent to outsiders, they sometimes actually even fall in love with them and marry them and have all kinds of relationships with them. But these also then become subject to immigration control. And the more seriously you try to control immigration, the more important it becomes to ensure that any opportunity to reduce the number of immigrants is taken. Now, this means, for example, Mrs. Wang, who was visiting her daughter from Hong Kong, and foolishly mentioned to an immigration official that what she was doing when she was visiting was helping her daughter, who had just had a baby, to nurse the baby. And she was immediately deported on the grounds that she was now working unauthorized in Britain. And she was told she could not return to Britain for another 10 years. And there are thousands of these cases. I'm not just picking up one. My point is not about poor Mrs. Wang, but her daughter and English husband and English child were now going to be deprived of their mother-in-law, mother, and grandparent for another 10 years, unless they themselves could go to Hong Kong. Or think about the South African couple who moved to Britain after having a terrible home invasion in South Africa. Wife was South African, husband was English. They set up a little shop, basically processing photos. But unfortunately, they paid themselves too little because they ran the shop, so they lived off the profits, which were quite small. But like most businesses, things worked through cash flow, and they were quite comfortable. But when it came for the husband to apply for the wife to become permanently settled in Britain, he was told no, because he did not earn enough to sponsor his partner, his wife of 25 years. In Britain, about 18,000 people every year are turned away because their partners are too poor to sponsor them. These may be people who've been married for many, many years. And these are the figures coming from the Home Office, not from researchers. So this means that every year, 18,000 Britons are affected by the fact that they are too poor to sponsor their partners to come into the country, which over a short period of time can give you hundreds of thousands of people. And this is not changing. You need about 16 to 18,000 pounds a year in order to be eligible to sponsor someone. Now, why is this the case? Well, it's the case because what the government is trying to do is to reduce immigration. Why do they want to reduce immigration? Well, because they think that it's bad in various ways, which I'll come to. But in order to then do this, you've also got to do things which are bad in other ways. One of the arguments is that we need immigration control in order to protect the interests of the poor who will suffer because of the competition from immigrants. But in another respect, of course, it is the poorest who are finding it most difficult if they happen to have the misfortune to fall in love with a foreigner. So immigration control does have an impact on the freedom of citizens and residents, even if its intention ultimately is not that, but simply to control outsiders for the sake of protecting insiders. The point I want to make is that this is a very, very doubtful proposition, and I can give you many, many examples of this sort to show how natives and residents are in fact adversely affected by the effort of immigration control. The more control you try to exercise, the more harm you will also do to your own citizens. But there's another further aspect to this, which I think is worth exploring by considering the case of South Africa, I want to say a little bit about the apartheid analogy. Here's a sentence or two from a former chairman of the Native Affairs Commissions in the Transvaal, who said, "A man cannot go with his wife and children and his goods and chattels onto the labor market. He must have a dumping ground. Every rabbit must have a warren where he can live and burrow and breed, and every native must have a warren too." What he was recognizing with this statement was a concern that underpinned the policy of apartheid, which came into effect in South Africa in the 1940s and lasted until 1994, but actually was a reflection of a much deeper and complicated racial history. The problem was that, to quote Max Frisch again, what they wanted was workers. The South African governments of various stripes over the early part of the 20th century wanted black labor, but they did not want black people coming into white areas for all kinds of reasons. Mostly, they said, cultural ones. They wanted to keep the people separate, but they wanted the workers to come in, mainly because it turned out that having the workers outside the cities, having them a long distance away, was not economically convenient. Okay? But the trouble is, these were not just workers, they're not just units of production, they're actually people with families, with children, with attachments, with commitments everywhere. If they came in, they wanted their warrens not 10, 20, 50 miles away. They wanted their families there with them. And equally, the white South Africans wanted to make sure that they didn't have to send their workers away at 5 o'clock because they had to go too far. So some sort of compromise had to be made. You had to find a way of bringing in the workers, but keeping them separate. What this required was a very, very complex system of laws which kept the two different sorts of peoples apart. The first question then became a definitional question. How do you distinguish between black and white, especially if some were of mixed descent? The consequence was an elaborate system of racial classification. Then you need to monitor movement. And with that came in the pass laws, which required people to show their passes, to show that they were legitimate. The next thing that happened was, of course, what are you going to do with all those white people who don't turn out to be so cooperative because they do things like fall in love with the black people that they met? Well, what you have to do now, and this is what happened in South Africa, is you have to control the white population as well. You have to bring in the Immorality Act, the Restriction of Marriages Act, and ultimately you have to bring in pass laws for whites as well. So they too will have to carry some form of identification. They too will have to be monitored and regulated and controlled. You would now have to clamp down on the courts. You would now have to clamp down on the newspapers. You would now stop citizens like Donald Woods from writing in South Africa. You would even try to stop him leaving South Africa because he might, as he did, go off and write about what was really happening in the country. And you had to do all this because there's one other thing you needed to do in order to control your own population. That is, you had to have them believe in the ideology of apartheid. And many of them resisted. Not everyone. There were many people who were quite convinced of the ideology. But you had to convince the people of this ideology. So what you needed was a level of control which went not just to controlling movement or controlling activity or controlling employment. You had to control people's thinking as well. And this is an inevitable consequence of immigration control. And this is how apartheid began, as a system of immigration control. There's one other interesting aspect to this, which I think makes the analogy with our own efforts of immigration control interesting. One of the first responses of black people in South Africa when they were excluded from white society was to set up their own enterprises, to set up their own farms, to set up their own collectives, and try to make their own way in the world. After all, they had lived there for many years. They were not without resources. But this meant that they could not be called upon to work in the mines and the factories and so on. So South African governments in the early part of the 20th century imposed taxes on these enterprises, made it more difficult for them by placing trade restrictions on their buying and selling of goods, until eventually those people were forced to come in to work in South African enterprises. And it makes me wonder about our own immigration policies and its relationship to our various trade policies, where we impose restrictions on all kinds of countries when it comes to trade, limiting their capacity and the opportunity to make their own way, to make a living. And then we turn around and say, but no, you can't come in here except on our terms, and are surprised when all of a sudden all of these people are wanting to come elsewhere because they can't make their own way in their own countries or in their own environment. The apartheid analogy, I think, is an instructive one, because this is really what immigration control ultimately means. It means control. It means control not just of outsiders, though it certainly means that. It means control over insiders as well. And this, I think, it's important to note, has a very serious consequence for other things that we might care about. It has an important consequence for equality and the rule of law. Because most obviously, if you're concerned about controlling a population, and if you're concerned about reaching certain goals or certain outcomes, well, one of the things that actually does stand in the way is the law. This is one of the things that governments have always found difficult. In order to achieve the end through due process is complex and difficult. To take just the most obvious example, in the United States, it said there are about 12 million illegal immigrants, whatever the term illegal might mean, because it has actually no legal meaning. But there are 12 million illegals. At present, the United States has the capacity to deport about 400,000 people a year, which means it'll take you about 25 years to deport all of these people if you do it through due process, assuming that no one else comes in the meantime. Okay? So if you're going to do this, you're either going to concede that you can't achieve this end, or you'll say, we've got to find another way. We've got to find a way around the difficulties imposed by the court system. And the consequence of this is, in fact, and I think demonstrably so, a dereliction of the ideal of the rule of law. It means more and more making deals with people within the whole legal process, granting discretionary powers to police, taking away discretionary power from judges in order to achieve certain ends, going completely against the ideal of the rule of law. And to give you a very dramatic kind of illustration of how this has happened, between 1930 and 2005, the United States deported, obviously by mistake, 1 million of its own citizens. In various times, it deported about 2 million people. 1 million of those were their own citizens. Why? Because at various stages, it went through thinking, we must get the immigration numbers down. What measures can we take? We will sweep through the neighborhoods that looks like they're full of Mexicans and pick up people who don't have the relevant documentation and deport them. But of course, the people who were least likely to have any kind of documentation were native-born citizens. Why would you have a passport or papers if you were just born there? Okay, the ones who are least likely to be caught out were the ones who were, in fact, proper immigrants with documentation. Certainly, it would have picked up some who came in without documentation, but it picked up a lot of people who were just American citizens. And although I gave you these figures from 1930 to 2005, this continues. Just recently, a young man by the name of Ace Francis died at the age of 29. He had come to the United States at the age of 2. His mother was from Jamaica. She married an American and moved to the United States. So he became a citizen by default at the age of 14. Whether he wanted to or not, he was an American citizen. But he was picked up on his way to a party where a fight had broken out, asked where he was from, said that he was born in Jamaica, was immediately sent to a detention center and deported to Jamaica through a complex series of misfortunes. His mother didn't know where he was. His father was someone not known to him. 10 years later, he found his way back to the United States, but had been living rough in Jamaica and simply passed away from illness. This was in 2015. So this happens all the time. It's not something that's anomalous. But my point here is that this is something that is not a bug in the system. This is a feature of the system. This is what you have to expect if you want immigration control. And the more seriously you want to control immigration, then the more of this you're going to have to expect. So the question is this worth it? Okay, so let me very briefly run through 3 kinds of arguments that say, yes, it's worth it nonetheless. We understand that these tragedies happen. We understand that control means control and that we are subjecting ourselves to this control, but it's worth it because, let's say, there are economic gains. Well, are there any economic gains? I think there are 2 kinds of arguments here to consider. First is an argument that says, our society will overall be better off if we control immigration. We'll have more wealth and more income. And the second argument says, we grant that there may not be any economic gain in terms of total wealth. There may be total wealth that's gained if we continue to admit immigrants, but what we're worried about is that all the gains will go to the rich and the poor will suffer. Let me look very quickly at these 2 arguments. The argument that says, look, we need immigration control in order to improve our living standards is simply unsustainable because although economists disagree about many things, one thing on which they're pretty well agreed is that the long-term benefits of immigration is a substantial increase in wealth and income in a society overall. In the short term, it's much less clear. If you take a period of 2 or 3 years, all of the evidence suggests that there may be a slight decline in income and wealth or a slight increase, and all of this is so close to the margin of error that it's hard to say that there's anything but a neutral effect from immigration. But the longer you leave it, the more clear it is that the economic benefits of immigration are very substantial. So critics of immigration, from an economic point of view, mostly worry about the distributional effects. Yes, there's an increase in income, there's an increase in wealth, but all of these gains, they say, go to the wealthy, to the middle classes. Those who suffer most are those at the bottom, those whose labor must compete with immigrant labor at the bottom end of the labor market. Surely, if we care about our own citizens, then we should be caring about this impact of immigration. I think there are 2 things to bear in mind here. Firstly, this particular concern, I think, is still misplaced in the longer term. It's only in the very short term that this could be true in some circumstances. In fact, those who are most badly affected by this competition from cheap immigrant labor is the previous generation of immigrants. Okay? So go back to the original question, what is an immigrant and what is a native? Okay? Are you talking about long-term natives, or are you talking about recent natives? And are you going to distinguish between these 2 when you're going to compare the effects? But the other thing to note is that if over the long term immigration actually produces more wealth and more income, we can safely say that as a result of immigration, the next generation is going to be wealthier. It's going to have a higher standard of living. It's going to have more income. Now, if that's the case, if your argument is that you want immigration control in order to protect your natives, what you're really saying is that we want to protect this generation of natives at the expense of the next generation of natives who will be better off from immigration control. Now, maybe this is justifiable, but the question is why? Why should we prefer current Britons to future Britons? I mean, we are nicer, I'm sure, but, maybe we just need to improve our parenting, and then make them deserving of the immigration that they're going to benefit from. So on the whole, I think, although I'm giving it, very, very short shrift here, the economic arguments are not convincing. There is a huge literature on this. There are dissenting voices. I can't answer every query at this point, but I think overall the economic arguments are not convincing. But I think a more difficult argument is the cultural argument, which says, well, it's not about money, it's not about income and wealth. What we're trying to do in controlling immigration is preserve the integrity of our culture. Okay? We want there to be a Britain in the future that is Britain, not something else. Now, I think here we confront a real difficulty, because what is the culture in question? Particularly, say, if you look at a country like the United States or Britain, which is already culturally pretty diverse. And I don't mean just diverse because of recent immigration. Think about just the history of Britain going back to Roman times. Britons have been fighting one another forever. And I don't mean just the Irish and the Scots versus the English. I mean, you can take into account the Welsh, you can take into account the Northern Scots and the Southern Scots, the various internal wars that have been fought. And many of these things have been over fairly deep and fundamental questions. So if you say that there's a common culture, what is that culture? Make it more complicated by thinking about all the people who've migrated over the years, legally and illegally. You've got a very complex, deep society with many cultural divides across religion, language, and so on. Well, you might say, okay, we've got a conception of culture, but it's very capacious. It includes all the people in this room even, okay? I mean, a very diverse crowd. Well, if that's the case, what is the case for excluding people because they're outsiders who might transform our culture? Our culture is already so capacious that it can take everyone into account. But if you say, no, we're not thinking of our culture in this way, we're thinking about it as something that's much thicker. It's not just something that includes everyone. Well, if that's the case, who does your current culture exclude? Is this something that represents everybody in your society, or is it just represent some subset, the real Americans, or the real Britons, or the real Australians, just to quote some of the phrases? Well, if you go down this path, then you've got a real problem, because what you're inducing is a culture war, which will stay there even if you stopped immigration dead in its tracks. The question is, who is it that counts? But I think you've got another problem too, which is that if you want to exclude people in order to preserve your cultural integrity, you're not going to be able to do this by just reducing the amount of immigration. You've got to be selective. You don't want the wrong kinds of people coming in. Well, if you decide that some kinds of people are the wrong kind, maybe they're Chinese, maybe they're Africans, maybe they're Australians, you're going to have to say to your existing citizens who have that ancestry, well, we can't allow people of your kind to come in. We'll only allow people of our kind. What are you then saying to your fellow citizens if you're going to treat them as equals? And of course, one of the unsavory sides of all of this is that inevitably this kind of argument has a racial dimension. And I haven't got time to go into this today, but the sad story of immigration control is that throughout its history, it's essentially been a mechanism for identity control, and that has meant mostly control on the basis of race. It hasn't necessarily been successful, but it has had an enormous impact. Well, let me then consider the last argument, which is the argument from self-determination, an argument that says, well, what we want to do is we want to control immigration because this is us taking our country back. Okay, a common phrase. The Australian Senator, Pauline Hanson, who came to prominence in the 1990s for her anti-immigrant and anti-Aboriginal sentiment, put it in this way. She said, Australia's my home, and I have the right to decide or to a say in who comes into my home. That is the basis for immigration control. We're like a family, and the family decides. Well, think about it in this way. If you're living in a household, let's say, of two people, just you and your wife, you and your partner. Well, let's say, start with just a household of one. I'd be pretty happy to say, yes, this is a good principle. You decide who comes into your home, except maybe it's a fireman and the building burning. Okay? But if it's you and your partner, I don't think you want to necessarily live in a house where each partner has a veto on anyone who could come in as a guest. It may not make for the best relationship. Or if you think about a family of, parents and children, you don't want to really say to your children, you can never have anybody home unless mother and father say it's okay. But, you could have some restrictions. But now, supposing you're living in a group house, do you really want to give everyone a veto of this kind? Or supposing you're living in an apartment complex, do you want every individual to have a veto or even a say in who you have coming into your home? Who you have to lunch, who you have to dinner, who you have to sleep over? What about a neighborhood? Do you want to give every neighbor a veto or a say in who you have coming in? Extend it to a city. This is my point. Okay? If you want self-determination, who is the self in question? Does that mean that everybody gets a veto or even a say? You could have a society that lives like this, but I put it to you, this would be an extremely undesirable sort of a society to live in, because what you're really doing is you're imposing controls, restrictions on the freedom of your fellow citizens. This is what all these arguments for self-determination don't really tell you. They put these as arguments about self-determination, saying we are taking back control, but we're not. What we're doing is actually giving some people the power to control us. And the question is, why would you think this means self-determination of any kind? To me, it looks like it's nothing of the sort. So I think there's a lot to argue with when it comes to the whole self-determination, taking back control argument. So just to wrap up, I think there are these three significant arguments in defense of and in favor of increasing immigration control. I think none of them work. My message in the end, however, is not to say, so let's move to a world of open borders. I'm not sure that's a feasible thing, even though I think in many ways it would be highly desirable. All I want to say is, be wary of those who are saying what we need is immigration control, and especially more immigration control, because of all the benefits that this is going to bring. My point to you is, it doesn't bring very many benefits, if it brings any benefits at all. Such benefits as it brings come to specific people, particularly to the powerful and those who are the influential. It's harmful to the poor, it's harmful to many citizens, and ultimately it means living in a society in which the most important values that we cherish, modern liberal democracies, the values of liberty and equality, are dishonored. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. When you've elucidated the complex interactions of of immigration and nationality, and the roles of definitions and of politics and culture and economics in this really complicated way that it all plays together and there isn't a straightforward answer or outcome. You've given us all a great deal to think about and to talk about, I'm sure, not just this evening, but on through the coming days. I mean, for me, some of this is very close to home, to personal experience. After we married, my husband was not allowed to give me anything more than housekeeping money. Why? This was a very long time ago. He was lecturing here in Cambridge, he had a job, but he was a temporary resident, and he had the wrong type of British passport. So, an exact example of some of what you were talking about earlier on. So, as I said earlier, each Darwin College lecture is filmed and then made freely available, and this lecture will be no exception. Early, middle of next week, it will be online. Thinking about next week, next Friday, Professor Khadija von Zinnenberg-Carroll will speak on art and migration. So I hope we see you then. Finally, once again, let's thank Chandran Kukathas very much indeed.